In this video, we're going to go over some details of the brain, in particular its structures and their respective functions. So here I'm drawing an outline of a person's skull with their brain in red. And if we move from the bottom of the brain upwards, we're actually moving through evolutionary history, from older structures at the bottom to structures that have evolved more recently up at the top. So here at the bottom we have the brain stem. This area is responsible for basic processes required for survival, including breathing, circulation, digestion, and swallowing. It's also a transfer pathway for neural signals to pass between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. Extending off the back of the brainstem is the cerebellum, here in green. This is heavily involved in motor control, allowing us to move. It drives our body movements and our motor memories. So these two parts of the brain are our most evolutionarily derived or primitive structures, the oldest. At the top of the brain, we have the most recently evolved parts of our brain, the cerebral cortex. This is the wrinkly outer layer of the brain, and it's responsible for our thoughts, perceptions, and complex behaviors. And here we'll move this out of the way. Without it, we wouldn't have culture like art and music. We wouldn't have communication like language and empathy. And we wouldn't be able to understand ourselves and the world around us in the way that we do. Between the evolutionarily newer cortex and the evolutionarily older brainstem, we have various brain structures that we call subcortical structures that I'm drawing here in yellow. And these structures drive basic emotions like fear and stress, and these structures also mediate behaviors that are important for survival, like eating and drinking. So now we're going to dig into each of these regions of the brain in a bit more detail. And we're going to talk about 16 different specific parts of the brain. And on your worksheet, you can follow along with each of these regions. Each region that I'd like you to know and track on your worksheet, I'll indicate with an asterisk. So the brainstem has three distinct regions. From the bottom to the top, they are 1, the medulla oblongata, 2, the pons, and 3, the midbrain. Each of these areas is involved in regulation of basal physiological processes in the body, like your heartbeat, your breathing rhythm, and your intestinal movements. The cerebellum in green is essential for coordinated movement and balance. If you take my movement neuroscience course, you'll learn much more about this region and other parts of the brain that drive our movements. If we zoom into the subcortical areas, we'll look at several regions that you should know. Here we have the thalamus in purple, which acts as a router. This passes information between various parts of the brain. Just above and kind of wrapping around the thalamus is the basal ganglia, here in blue, which is heavily involved in controlling our movements. This is the part of the brain that breaks down in patients that suffer from Parkinson's disease. In pink here is the hippocampus, which sticks out beneath the thalamus. Here we'll move this out of the way to fit in all the other parts. And this is where we think information gets consolidated from short-term to long-term memory. It's also where spatial memory is encoded. We'll learn a lot more about this part of the brain when we study memory. The next few brain parts that we'll talk about control parts of the endocrine system. The endocrine system releases hormones into the body to regulate different physiological processes. The hypothalamus, here in light pink, is right below the thalamus, and it's the main structure responsible for homeostasis. Homeostasis is the stable body state kept that way by various physiological processes. So the hypothalamus is heavily involved in regulating body temperature, circadian rhythms, blood pressure, blood glucose levels, blood osmolarity, and more. Because of this involvement in homeostasis, it's also important for motivated behaviors like thirst, hunger, and aggression. The pituitary gland, here in green, sends out hormones and drives our stress response. And it's not just any old gland. The posterior part of the gland is actually considered part of the brain. The amygdala, in neon green, is located just in front of the hippocampus, and it's in the temporal lobe, which we'll get to in a second. It's a cluster of neurons that drives our response to fear and mediates our fear-associated memories. So all of these structures, plus the cortex above, comprise the cerebrum. This is where integration happens. Information comes in and the brain makes sense of it and then sends out signals that modulate our physiological processes and drive our voluntary movements. The cerebral cortex up here at the top makes up 80% of our brain's volume and is comprised of 4 distinct lobes. So we'll break this out down below so we can look at it in more detail. The frontal lobe, here in yellow, is responsible for executive function, things like forming thoughts and making decisions, and also emotional control. The parietal lobe, right here in blue, is where sensory processing happens. Sensory signals come in and are interpreted. The occipital lobe at the back here in green is where visual processing occurs. And the temporal lobe here in purple is involved in language production, hearing, and memory formation. On the border between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, we have our last two important regions that we'll discuss. Here in black, we have the somatosensory cortex. This is in the anterior part of the parietal lobe, the frontmost part. This is where touch sensory information comes into the brain for processing. And here in reddish brown, we have the motor cortex, and this is in the very posterior part of the frontal lobe. Posterior meaning furthest back. And this motor cortex is where motor plans are generated and sent out to other parts of the brain and eventually out to the body. One classification of a brain system that you should be aware of is called the limbic system. Several parts that we've already described comprise the limbic system, including parts of the cortex, the hypothalamus, hippocampus, and amygdala. These areas work in concert to drive emotional processing, motivation, and learning. We'll get more practice in class looking at the structures and functions of different parts of the brain.